What started as a congressional hearing on financial equity took a sharp, unexpected turn when Congressman Byron Donalds laughed, openly, at Denzel Washington. But this wasn't Hollywood, and Denzel wasn't acting. What followed wasn't just a response. It was a dismantling, slow, deliberate, and devastating. In less than 5 minutes, the room went from smug chuckles to stunned silence, and Byron Donalds learned that some legacies don't stay buried, especially when Denzel Washington is the one unearthing them. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The algorithm doesn't see race, Denzel Washington said evenly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that precedes a storm. It inherits it. The words had barely settled in the air when it happened. A sharp, unmistakable laugh cut through the chamber. Byron Donalds leaned back in his leather chair, arms crossed, head tilted slightly to the side, as if the very idea amused him beyond belief. It wasn't a chuckle. It wasn't nervous. It was deliberate, loud, and dripping with something that didn't need translation. Mockery. C-SPAN's cameras caught everything. The angle shifted. One Republican staffer sitting just behind Donalds quickly looked down and smirked, biting the inside of his cheek to keep from joining in. Another, further down the bench, failed to hide it. He covered his mouth, but his eyes crinkled in laughter. Meanwhile, a Democratic staffer too rose back, turned away, jaw tight, fingers clasped around the pen in his lap like it might snap. No one said anything, not yet, but the sound had changed the room. It altered the temperature, not metaphorically, but tangibly. People shifted in their seats. The faint hum of fluorescent lighting and distant air conditioning seemed to disappear. What remained was only silence, and the echo of that laugh still hanging in the air like smoke after a match has been struck. Denzel didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He didn't meet the laughter with indignation or fire. Instead, he moved the way only someone trained to own space could move. Slowly, precisely, like every gesture meant something. He turned his head, not all at once, but gradually, until his eyes landed on Byron Donalds. The kind of stare that doesn't just acknowledge the room, but takes control of it. The congressman from Florida maintained his posture, unaware or unwilling to recognize that the balance of power had just shifted. His smile lingered, smaller now, but still there. Denzel blinked once. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his blazer. His hand moved with care, not as if reaching for notes or statistics, but something older, something that had weight. When it emerged, he held not a stack of documents or a phone or a chart. He held a worn leather wallet, the kind that softens and darkens over decades, molded by years in a back pocket. He laid it gently on the desk in front of him, resting his palm on it for just a moment, like someone remembering something too important to say out loud. Across the dais, someone shifted uncomfortably. A cough echoed from the press box. Still, no words from Denzel. Just the weight of that wallet on the polished surface and the space that suddenly felt too small to contain the silence. A Democratic aide whispered something to her colleague, her eyes locked on the scene unfolding. A Republican staffer stopped typing. The stenographer glanced up, fingers hovering just above her keyboard. It wasn't scripted. It didn't need to be. Everyone understood instinctively that something had just broken. Not a rule, not a policy, but something older. An agreement, perhaps unspoken, that there were limits to how far one could publicly mock another's lived experience. And yet Byron Donalds had crossed that line with a laugh. Denzel finally spoke again, but not to Donalds. Not yet. His voice was softer this time, meant less for the microphones and more for the memory he carried. "There are things we inherit," he said, still looking down at the wallet. "Not wealth, not immunity, but reminders." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. In one corner of the room, a congressional staffer leaned toward her colleague and said quietly, "That's his father's." It wasn't confirmation. It was recognition. The cameras kept rolling. The lights kept humming, but something fundamental had shifted, not just in the chamber, but in the hearts of those watching. A man had laughed at legacy, and now that legacy was sitting on the table, waiting to be heard. The wallet stayed on the table, untouched. Denzel didn't move, and neither did the moment. It lingered like smoke in an old room. What had started as a laugh had hardened into silence, and inside that silence was a story, long, buried, and unfinished. The story didn't begin with this hearing. Not really. It started long before either man stepped into this room. Long before the cameras rolled or the microphones picked up the tension between two voices shaped by entirely different worlds. Byron Donalds was 45, a rising Republican congressman from Florida, the kind of black conservative that made cable news producers giddy. He had the polish, the bite, and the bullet points. Brooklyn-born, Naples-groomed. His rise was fast, smooth, media-trained. He didn't walk away from fights, he walked toward them. His brand was self-made defiance, pulled up by bootstraps, survivor of the system. Proof, they said, that if one black man could do it, the system couldn't be that broken. Fox News called him a voice of reason. Others called him the exception sold as the rule. And Donalds leaned into that narrative, proudly, publicly. Repeatedly, he had once said on national television that government assistance was a crutch that turns into a coffin. That generational poverty was not a policy failure, but a mindset problem. That America didn't need to change, people just needed to try harder. He became a darling of the right not in spite of his blackness, but because of it. He offered permission. He gave the system a mirror it liked to look into. And for some, that was enough to call it truth. Then there was Denzel, not the movie star this country thinks it knows, not the red carpet smile or the Hollywood suits. This was the Denzel who, away from cameras, had built something most people had never heard of, a community financial initiative called Man Up, designed to teach young black men how to navigate a system that had never been designed for them. It started small, a church basement in Watts, then a community center in Newark, then a partnership with local banks, reluctant at first, until media heat and quiet pressure forced a few to cooperate. Within a decade, Man Up had reached over 200,000 students, from Oakland to Baltimore, from Atlanta to Detroit. They learned credit literacy, homeownership strategy, investment fundamentals, and most importantly, how to speak to power. Not through protest, through fluency. Denzel didn't advertise it, no red carpet press releases, no headlines. He just showed up week after week, city after city, like it was his real job. Because to him it was. But the moment these two men truly collided came 5 years ago, on live television. A CNN town hall had invited Byron Donalds and Denzel Washington to speak about systemic inequality. It was supposed to be civil, even friendly. Instead, it became something else. In a now infamous exchange, Donalds had called social programs toxic sympathy, accusing Democrats of weaponizing victimhood to maintain political control. Denzel, sitting beside him, didn't interrupt. He waited until Donalds had finished, then turned, looked him dead in the eye, and said one sentence. "I've never seen sympathy put a kid through college, but I've seen cruelty close the door." The clip went viral. Donalds didn't flinch, he doubled down. Denzel walked away from the cameras that night, but the seed was planted, and it had been growing ever since. They didn't speak again until now, and now here they were. Two men with matching skin tones but opposite philosophies. One saw progress as proof that the system worked. The other saw it as the exception that proved how broken the system still was. They were not enemies in the theatrical sense. They didn't shout at each other. They didn't call names. Their confrontation was colder than that. Quieter, sharper. It was the kind of rivalry that lives in the space between words. The kind built not on animosity, but on insult disguised as ideology. In the committee room, no one watching needed context to feel what was unfolding. But those who knew, those who remembered the CNN moment, who had followed the work, who had seen the quiet chessboard laid out over years, understood that this wasn't just a hearing. This was the next move. The hearing had a title, something dry, something procedural, but none of that mattered anymore because this was no longer about banking policy. This was about inheritance, not of money or status, but of silence. Of stories, of wallets too light to matter in markets but too heavy to forget. Denzel had come prepared, not with facts alone, but with memory. And Donalds, for all his media training, had laughed at the wrong man at the wrong moment. And now every eye was on the wallet, every ear tuned to the breath between lines. Waiting, not for policy, for reckoning. The silence was heavy, but Byron Donalds couldn't help himself. He leaned forward just enough to reach his microphone. adjusted it with the kind of ease that comes from media training and long hours in front of studio lights, and let the words fall like oil on fire. "Maybe next time," he said with a dry smirk. "Bring your Oscar instead of data, Mr. Washington." It wasn't just the words, it was the delivery, the timing, the way he glanced sideways as he said it, drawing out the syllables like a man enjoying his own cleverness. The tone wasn't heated, it was amused, and somehow that made it worse. A sharp inhale broke from someone in the second row of the audience. A congressional staffer stiffened, her fingers frozen above her keyboard. Across the dais, an older Republican member, one who had served long before either of these men held a microphone, tapped his pen once against the table. Not loud, just enough to signal discomfort. A small, coded warning. Enough. Denzel didn't look up, not right away. He sat still, both hands resting flat on the table, one on the wallet, the other on a small manila folder that hadn't been touched since he arrived. His face showed no shift, no irritation. Just the same calm, deliberate stillness that had unsettled the room minutes earlier. Then, finally, he looked toward the chairman. "Mr. Chairman," he said softly, without raising his voice, "may I?" Chairman McHenry didn't speak, but he gave a slow nod. It wasn't procedural. It was something closer to respect. Denzel's hand moved to the wallet again. He opened it carefully, like someone opening a memory. From inside, he pulled a single sheet of paper, folded, yellowed at the edges, creased down the middle from having lived too long in a back pocket. He placed it flat on the table, turned it so the typewritten words faced the room. No one moved. Denzel didn't announce it. He didn't need to. But a staffer sitting a few feet away leaned in, squinting slightly, then whispered to her colleague, "That's a Social Security letter. Denied credit." Her voice caught in her throat. "That's real." There was a silence then, not the silence of awkwardness or tension or confusion. This was a different silence, the kind that comes only when truth has entered the room and demanded space. Denzel finally spoke. "My father," he said, looking not at Donalds but down at the paper, "applied for a home repair loan in 1978. He had a stable job, no criminal record, paid his taxes, 3 children, a wife, clean credit." His voice was even, controlled, but each word landed like a stone in water. "The bank's response," he continued, "arrived 2 weeks later, denied. No explanation beyond risk profile inconsistent with lending parameters." He looked up, eyes sweeping slowly across the chamber, but we knew what it meant. A reporter in the gallery scribbled something, then stopped. Her pen hovered above the page. Some moments are better remembered than transcribed. Denzel tapped the page gently just once. "This," he said, "was my inheritance." Donald shifted in his chair, just slightly, but enough. "My mother kept it," Denzel said. "She folded it and put it in his wallet. Said one day I'd understand why we could never fix the stairs, why the water heater stayed broken for 2 years, why he stopped laughing at dinner." He paused, not for drama, for breath. "And I do understand now." No one interrupted. No one dared. "My father worked 3 jobs. He never asked for handouts. He didn't believe in victimhood. But when that letter came, something changed. Not just in our house, but in his eyes." He leaned back slightly, his hand still resting on the paper. "When you mocked data, Congressman," he said slowly, "you weren't mocking me. You were mocking this. The kind of paper that lives in black wallets and never leaves." Donalds opened his mouth, then closed it. The cameras were still rolling. Denzel turned back to the chairman. "I came here to talk about systems," he said. "But sometimes systems leave evidence, and sometimes that evidence fits in a pocket." The room remained frozen. There were no speeches, no claps, no one grandstanding for airtime, just the thinnest sheet of paper resting on polished oak, holding more weight than any legislation in the room. And beside it, the man who refused to let it be forgotten. Denzel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room was already holding its breath. Still seated, he reached down beside his chair and retrieved a slim folder, thinner than most briefing packets, but heavier in implication. He opened it slowly, revealing a single printed document with a watermark faintly visible beneath the text. A PDF, blown up onto the hearing room monitor with one motion of his hand. Across the screen, the header read, Southern Equity Trust Internal Risk Assessment Memo, confidential. Some of the staffers in the gallery leaned forward. A few glanced at their phones. Others didn't blink. Denzel gestured lightly toward the screen. His tone remained calm, almost intimate, as if he were speaking directly to someone who had long forgotten how to listen. "This is a memo from 2021, he said, leaked by a whistleblower to our community legal clinic in Philadelphia, never meant to be seen by the public, but it was." He turned slightly, not toward Byron Donalds, but toward the committee as a whole. The document outlines internal credit screening practices used by Southern Equity Trust. Specifically, how the bank's risk model assigns elevated threat scores to applicants from certain zip codes, regardless of credit score or income verification. He paused to let that settle. "Those zip codes," he continued, "just happen to be over 80% Black or Latino." The monitor flicked to the next page. Highlighted text, bolded numbers, phrases like legacy blocklisting and demographic flags. Denzel looked toward the chairman. The air in the room was still, but thick with realization. "The same bank that denied my father a loan in 1978, he said, still uses algorithms that penalize neighborhoods like the one I grew up in. Different language, same result." Then he turned, finally, to Byron Donalds. "But it gets worse," he said, and the temperature in the chamber seemed to drop a few degrees. The screen shifted again. This time it showed a campaign finance report, Byron Donalds' Political Action Committee, and a highlighted line that read, "Contribution, Southern Equity Trust PAC /$40,000, Q3 2022. "Congressman," Denzel said quietly, "this bank didn't just harm my family. It didn't just deny opportunity to generations of Black and brown communities. It now funds your campaign operation." Donalds blinked. "This isn't a theoretical debate anymore," Denzel said. "This is personal, not just to me, but to every family who's ever sat at a kitchen table trying to understand why the system always finds a reason to say no." He stood up for the first time. The movement was slow, measured, like a man not performing for cameras but bearing something that could no longer be carried seated. His presence, already commanding, now filled the room in a different way. Not as a celebrity, not as a witness, as a son, as a vessel. "You didn't just laugh at me," Denzel said, his voice steady. "You laughed at my father, at every father who ever walked out of a bank holding silence instead of a loan. You mocked not data, but memory. You took that pain, wrapped it in talking points, and used it to raise money." Donald's smile was gone. His hands, previously folded in front of him, now fidgeted with a pen. He didn't interrupt. "He couldn't. You used our struggle as a backdrop for your rise," Denzel continued. "Told the country that Black pain was a myth while cashing checks signed by institutions built to perpetuate it." No one moved. Even the chairman had stopped flipping through his notes. Denzel stepped closer to the table, gently placing the printed memo next to the Social Security denial letter. "Two pieces of paper," he said, 43 years apart. And yet the same signature runs through them, denial dressed as policy. He turned his gaze back to Donalds. "I don't know what you see when you look at me, Congressman. Maybe a Hollywood liberal, maybe a man who doesn't belong here. But I know what I see when I look at you." He paused. "I see someone who had the chance to stand for something and chose instead to sit beside those who profit from forgetting." Donalds lowered his eyes. The silence wasn't just heavy now, it was conclusive, not the silence before an answer, the silence after one. In the gallery, a young woman wiped her cheek. A stenographer exhaled sharply and caught herself. Outside the hearing room, phones buzzed with notifications. Inside, the weight of history pressed down on polished wood and institutional carpet, and at the center of it stood a man holding not vengeance, but receipts. Receipts too long ignored, receipts that didn't expire. Denzel sat back down, not to retreat, but to let the truth settle. And in that moment, Byron Donalds realized the real currency in the room wasn't applause or airtime. It was legacy, and he had spent his. Denzel let the silence hold for a moment longer. He had just laid down 2 sheets of paper that spanned 40 years of institutional denial, both different in ink but identical in intent. The room hadn't moved since. Eyes stayed fixed, not on the documents but on him. They were waiting for the next blow, but Denzel didn't strike again. Instead, he turned his head slightly and said a single name. Malik. The word cut through the air like a quiet bell in a church. Not shouted, not declared, just offered as if it would explain everything. From the second row behind the witnesses' table, a young man stood, early 30s, tall. Crisp white shirt, no tie. Posture straight but not rehearsed. The kind of man who had learned not to waste movement. His hands were clasped in front of him, fingers locked not with nervousness but discipline. His eyes met Denzel's first, then the committee's. Then, finally, Byron Donalds. "My name is Malik Jefferson," he said, his voice steady. "I was part of the first full graduating cohort of Man Up in 2012. A ripple moved through the chamber, not applause, just breath, as if the name carried weight beyond the syllables. "I was raised in East New York," Malik continued. "My father was incarcerated when I was 7. He applied for a small business loan when I was 15 to open a repair shop. He had paid his dues, had a clean record, but the application was denied because his mailing address was flagged as high risk." He paused, eyes scanning the room with precision, not to perform, to make sure they heard him. "My father never reapplied. He told me later, the system's not broken, son, it's just not built for us." He looked down for half a breath, then back up. "I believed that for years." He turned to Denzel, "Until I met him." There was no gesture, no grand narrative swell, just a truth being handed to the room like a key. "Man Up gave me the language of the system," Malik said. "Credit scores, lending algorithms, institutional policy. But more than that, it gave me the right to challenge what I'd been told was permanent." 2 years ago, Malik said, he'd been hired by Southern Equity Trust, the same bank that denied his father. He entered as a junior analyst in the risk modeling department. By most accounts, it was an impossible entry, unorthodox background, no Ivy League credentials. But he had built an open-source credit scoring prototype during grad school that caught the attention of someone on the inside. He had walked into the system through the very back door they had once slammed on his family. "I didn't go in to burn it down," Malik said, his voice calm. "I went in to understand it." And over time, they gave him room. Little by little he climbed, until last fall when the bank's predictive model was due for overhaul and Malik led the team that rebuilt it. He clicked a remote. The screen behind him lit up with a flowchart, simple, clean, annotated. This, Malik said, was the original risk model. It prioritized zip code, incarceration history, family structure, and school district performance as indirect variables. In practice, it meant that a man like my father could be flagged as a credit risk just for living in the same place too long. The chart changed. "This," he said, "is the new model." It was stripped of proxies. Zip code weighting was gone. Income-to-debt ratio now led the formula. School district scoring was replaced with individual applicant history. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was his. Byron Donalds shifted again, arms folded tighter now as if trying to will himself smaller. Malik didn't look at him. He looked back at Denzel. "Your policies," Denzel said, turning toward Donalds now, "broke his family." Then he gestured to the screen. "But his code rewrites your legacy." It wasn't said with malice. It wasn't vengeance. It was a correction. Donalds had no response. His eyes dropped not in shame, but in recalculation. He had built a platform on exceptionalism, on the story that systems could be overcome by grit alone. But grit hadn't rewritten the algorithm. A child of the very families he dismissed had done that, quietly, thoroughly, from the inside. And now the system bore his fingerprint. Malik nodded once and sat down. He didn't need to say more. The room had shifted again, not from fire, but from something softer and more dangerous. Hope, not blind hope. Not the kind politicians sell in speeches. This was earned. This was structured. This had data behind it. A man had laughed at legacy, then he tried to bury it, but it had been recoded. And now the next generation sat beside the past, not to mourn it, but to reprogram it. Not out of spite, out of design. The room had settled into a stillness so precise it felt sculpted. The kind that only follows truth delivered without apology. Malik's story had landed like a final chord in a song too long unresolved, but Denzel wasn't finished. Not yet. He remained seated for a moment longer, one hand resting near the old Social Security denial letter, the other beside the newer campaign finance record. Two pieces of paper, two eras, same system. Then he reached into the folder once more. This time he pulled out something that looked older, an aged document, slightly yellowed but meticulously preserved. He held it up so the cameras could catch the heading. Republican National Committee Platform, 1968. A few members of the room visibly reacted, not with surprise but recognition. The platform from the year Richard Nixon won the presidency. The year the party sought to define itself not just by opposition to liberalism, but by a declaration of values. Denzel read slowly, word for word. In a just society, economic justice is inseparable from moral justice. We believe in the dignity of work, the fairness of opportunity, and a marketplace that serves the nation, not just the privileged. He paused, then looked across the dais to Byron Donalds. Justice in economy is justice in nation. The words echoed, not with volume but with weight. They were not his words. They belonged to the very party Donalds claimed to serve. Denzel lowered the page, his eyes never leaving Donalds. That was your party's vision in 1968, before the talking points, before the algorithms, before the smirks and the cable hits. Donalds shifted in his seat, not with defiance, with discomfort. Denzel didn't accuse, he revealed. You didn't inherit conservatism, he said. You rebranded cruelty. A few heads turned. A camera operator adjusted his angle. The room had begun to transform again, less about one man and more about what he represented. You cosplay toughness, Denzel said, voice calm, almost sorrowful. You confuse callousness with principle, and every time you laugh at suffering, every time you weaponize poverty to score a point, you are not defending conservatism. You are degrading it. Donalds blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. There were no flashcards prepared for this moment. You think standing on a debate stage and saying, "Work harder," makes you a leader. But leadership is not measured by how easily you walk past the wounded. It is measured by how you carry the ones history keeps trying to forget. Across the dais, something unexpected happened. An older Republican congressman, one who had remained silent throughout the hearing, seated 2 chairs away from Donalds, slowly removed his microphone earpiece. Then, without a word, he stood. The act was simple. But in that moment, it said everything. He walked out of the chamber. No eye contact, no dramatic exit, just quiet descent. A man who had seen his party's language bent until it no longer recognized itself. The cameras caught it. So did the country. Denzel continued. You could have stood on the shoulders of those who fought for free markets and moral grounding. You could have invoked the names of Lincoln or Eisenhower or even Goldwater. But instead, you chose the script that made you famous. You chose a version of conservatism that stokes applause, not reflection. The silence returned, not the awkward kind, the historical kind. You don't defend conservatism, Denzel said. You cosplay cruelty. It wasn't an attack, it was a eulogy. He sat back slowly, as if laying something to rest. In that instant, Donalds was no longer just a congressman in a suit. He had become something else. A symbol not of victory or resilience, but of something frayed, something lost. The lights didn't dim, the room didn't erupt, but the air had shifted once again. And now, more than ever, it felt like a courtroom, not of law, but of legacy. Denzel sat still for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle. The papers on the table, the boy who became a coder. The party that once believed in justice, now silenced by its own reflection. Across from him, Byron Donalds remained seated, his jaw tight, the swagger long gone. But this was no longer about him. Denzel turned toward the front of the room where the camera feeds were still broadcasting. C-SPAN, local affiliates, national networks. Every lens was pointed toward him, but his eyes didn't seek the attention. They sought the people watching. The people outside the room who never got a seat inside it. The people who never got a mic or a folder or a vote, just a denial letter. He looked directly into the lens. America, he said, his voice measured but resolute, your memory is short. He didn't blink, but our scars are long. The room was quiet again, not stunned, listening. My father's wallet was empty, Denzel continued, tapping the worn leather with his fingertips. but it carried the weight of a system. He didn't need to explain. Everyone understood now. It wasn't about one man's bank denial. It was about the millions of unseen hands reaching into homes and futures and folding opportunities into dust. The chairman cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, sounded different, like someone standing under a ceiling that had just shifted above them. I am hereby initiating a formal subpoena for Southern Equity Trust. They will appear before this committee within 30 days. No one clapped, but the sentence landed like a crack of thunder in a courtroom that had waited too long for a verdict. A few seats behind Donalds, a young aide glanced down at his phone. His face twitched, then stilled. He whispered something to his colleague, who looked up quickly, eyes wide. A major banking firm, one of Donald's top donors, had just pulled its financial support. The email had gone out internally 5 minutes ago. Effective immediately, we are ending all contributions to any political committee receiving funds from Southern Equity Trust. The collapse wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Outside the hearing room, a small press crowd had already formed near the steps. Malik stood just inside the doors, his jacket slightly wrinkled, his brow furrowed, not with nerves but purpose. He didn't check his notes. He didn't look for approval. When the microphones came close, he said only 6 words. He didn't laugh when I couldn't, and just like that, a generation that had once been told to endure finally spoke. Not through protest, through precision. Inside, Denzel gathered his papers slowly. He didn't rush. He folded the letter from 1978 back into the wallet like he was tucking away a relic, not to forget, but to preserve. He stood, thanked the chairman, and nodded toward Malik, who gave the smallest nod in return. No fist raised, no chest thumped, just a silent handoff between memory and motion. Reporters shouted questions, cameras clicked. But Denzel didn't answer. He had already said everything that mattered. As he exited the chamber, the weight of his words remained, circling in the minds of everyone who had witnessed what no one expected, a reckoning without rage, a confrontation without cruelty, a dismantling done not with fire but with fact, with history, with dignity. And far beyond the marble walls of Capitol Hill, in barber shops and breakfast tables and quiet living rooms, Americans who had once given up on being heard sat a little straighter. Because someone had spoken, not for them, as them, and the country remembered, if only for a moment, what justice was supposed to sound like.